Okay, Genesis chapter 10, please. Genesis chapter 10. Our title tonight is The Genesis of the Nations. Thought that was fitting for the weekend that we're approaching, the Genesis of the Nations. Now, last time we were in Genesis was back in September 29th actually, so kind of took a month off. And I just want to remind you of some of God's lessons that He had for us. If you recall the circle of death that we read about, how man is limited by the cycle of life and death, where he lives and he works and he has children, and he lives and he works and he dies. But because of Jesus, we believe Jesus is our hope in life and death, and so we have passed from death unto life, and so we believe that we are on a new circle of life. And I would have Brother Tommy sing the circle of life for us, but probably have better bets of other things. But the circle of death is not yours anymore, and so I want to encourage you to walk with Jesus. He gives you life. We remember the world's deadline is coming. There is a day coming where this world will come to an end and be totally burned with fire. And so it's important that we obey Jesus. It's important to take God seriously about these things because He's never wrong. He never gets a forecast wrong. Do you remember the box? Maybe even though you expect Jesus to come back and expect to have eternal life and you have that hope, maybe you feel confined by present circumstances of life or difficulties in your life, and you feel like you're in a box, kind of like Noah was boxed in and left waiting. Well, God remembers the box, and He remembers you in it, and He encourages you to wait on Him. Do you remember the rainbow? The promise of God, the token like a wedding ring of His promise to man, that He is committed to life on earth. He is more committed to man and man having life than man is committed to man having life. Man gets worse and worse and heads toward death, and instead of protecting and preserving life, he does the opposite, yet God is committed to life. And you remember the couch I had over here. And I want to encourage you to stay off the couch on, well, not Sunday night, obviously. That was a celebratory time on the couch, like if you're a Braves fan. If you're not, well, I probably could say something uncouth there, but shouldn't. Anyway, so remember the couch, okay? And so in your fourth quarter of life, finish strong. Finish strong. Don't quit. Don't give up. Don't get casual, okay? Don't get ordinary. Finish strong. And so some good Old Testament lessons for New Testament believers. Well, tonight I want to move your attention from your life to a world scale and then back from a world scale to your life. I have my map with me over here. And this is, Luke Hawk has been so kind to tell me that this is not an updated version of this map, but it's a map of the world nonetheless. And this map represents quite a bit, doesn't it? There's a lot of nations here, a lot of people here represented, some 8 billion people. Some 8 billion people who breathe just like you breathe, who eat like you eat. Most of them ate far less today than you probably have eaten. And, well, I don't know how, you understand what I'm saying. Problems, struggles, difficulties the world over. Okay. Also have a globe. This might give a better picture, a better representation of the complexity of life on this globe. And besides, we don't believe the earth is flat, right? It's a complex globe with lots of people and lots of problems and lots of things going on. And you ever feel like the world is just huge? You ever feel like the world's problems are massive? And do you ever feel, when you think about that you are very, very small? Who feels super duper small when they think about those things? Well, what's on your mind when you think about some of these things in the world? And I want to talk about some major risks to the world. The spread of communism. What's on your mind about that? When you think about Red China and Russia. No, I'm not shaping this into a political message, but China, Russia, North Korea, what do you think about? What about the spread of Islam? You think about Afghanistan and Iran and Saudi Arabia. Those are major world movers and shakers, okay? What do you think about when you think about the rapid decline of what this represents? And whatever issues are pertinent to you in your life, whether it's the open border crisis or whether it's the rising inflation. I've read something the other day where this could be the most expensive Thanksgiving in a long time. Maybe I should tell Elizabeth we're going to have beans and rice and kind of shape it into the shape of a turkey. I don't know. Maybe have some Spam. What's on your mind when you think about the United States of America? What is on your mind when you think about the world? You know, you think about the United States and we don't hold the same beliefs and values as the rest of the world, do we? That's why it's free and it's a desirable place to be. We have not been like our neighbors, and many of their values are largely anti-God and anti-good. Yet all of that has come to America, hasn't it? And America is rapidly changing, isn't it? And the world is changing. So what's on your mind when you think about the world? I mean, you have to live a life in the United States of America. What are your plans? Does the world's condition jeopardize your plans for life, for your future? Does this melting pot of a nation concern you? Are you fearful that your dreams will not come true? What's on your mind about the future of your children, your grandchildren? What's on your mind when you think about the world? And thinking about these things can be very revealing, okay? Because obviously certain things just came to mind for you. And perhaps certain fears were just rekindled. And likely certain habits of yours just restarted, and you are in planning mode, but I have a golden question for you tonight. Where does God fit into your racing thoughts? And where do God's plans for the world fit into your plans? Harvest Sunday is this Sunday, and we emphasize missions, and we have to ask ourselves, who are we? We are Emmanuel. We're Emmanuel Baptist Church, and we believe God is with us. We've been saved. We believe the gospel, and we are members one of another in this body, and He is our head. And what's our mission? Our mission is to make disciples of all nations and generations. And how do we do that? We gather as the church. We assemble and we grow as disciples. That means we serve and we love and we fellowship with one another. And then we go back out into the world with the gospel. And that has a variety of ways that we go about that. But God's plans for the world should be at the heart of who we are. But are they at the heart of who you are? You say, well, how do I know if they are? Well, tell me your plans. Do we need to go back to these lessons from Genesis for a minute? About following Jesus to a T and finishing strong? Or perhaps have you moved on from them to take matters of life into your own hands? Have you moved on from those lessons? What's your mindset about your plans? Chapter 10 and 11 of Genesis reveals a world that had moved on from the lessons of the flood. And everything seemed to go according to plan. I mean, God's plan for Noah and his sons was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And that's what seemed to happen, because you look at the end of chapter 10, it says that by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So it seemed to happen. But Genesis chapter 11 tells a different story, a hands-on story. People took things into their own hands. And chapters 10 and 11 was a needed reminder for the nation of Israel again and again and again. And often, this is what would happen, they would live in fear about what was going on in their life and in their world. And so they would begin to take matters into their own hands. And I feel like we may need this reminder too. Now, Genesis chapter 10 gave Israel the backdrop to their world, okay? This represents the new world, humanity after the flood. Look at chapter 10, verse 1. It talks about these are the generations of the sons of Noah. You have Shem and Ham and Japheth, and unto these three guys were sons born after the flood. And then it's interesting because chapter 10 lists their descendants backwards. Okay, so here's the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then it goes out to list. First, the sons of Japheth, then the sons of Ham, then the sons of Shem. And that's on purpose, and we'll see why. But the first listing was the sons of Japheth. If you'll notice verse 2. And from verse 2 to verse 5 are the sons of Japheth. And it lists, I think, about 7 sons here: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tiras. And then it goes into 2 of his sons in verses 3 and 4, Gomer and Javan. And then in verse 5, it kind of gave a summary. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families or their clans, in their nations. And so the sons of Japheth were the group with which Israel, remember, Israel was the first reader of this, they were the group of people, the people groups with which Israel had the least amount of contact. If you picture there the Mediterranean Sea and the nation of Israel, and these nations would have been to the north and the northeast and the northwest of the nations of Israel, and so they would have had the least amount of contact. The second listing is the sons of Ham. From verses 6 through verse 20, it says the sons of Ham. And this is a larger listing. Obviously, it gave the sons of Ham a lot more room, and that's because they were Israel's most influential neighbors. The sons of Ham, the descendants of Ham, were Israel's most influential neighbors. In verse 6, it lists the sons of Ham. There's 4 of them: Cush and Mizraim, which is translated elsewhere, Egypt, and Phut, downset Phut, and Canaan. Okay, so you have these 4 sons. We recognize Canaan. Verses 7 through 12, it goes into the sons, the descendants of Cush, which Cush is often associated with Ethiopia, which that is further south than Egypt. And you'll note he goes Cush, Mizraim, Canaan. He kind of works south to north on up, okay? This is like Bible Old Testament survey 101 here, but hang with me. Okay, so you have Cush here, and his sons are listed out: Seba and Havilah and Sabta and Raamah and Sabtika, and the sons of Raamah, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush, verse 8, begat this guy named Nimrod. And it's not a name of a penguin, a Mr. Popper's penguin, although it is, I guess. But Nimrod was a mighty one in the earth. Verse 9 says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it was said, there was a common saying in that time, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And you have this reminiscence of these, remember back before the flood, there were the mighty ones in the earth. There were giants in the earth in those days. And they were mighty in the earth, and they were powerful and strong and did whatever they wanted to do. That's kind of the idea you get with Nimrod. And Nimrod, in fact, he had a kingdom. It says in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was, whoa, watch this, Babel. That's going to come up in a minute. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Shinar, that's important to note. And out of that land went forth Ashur, other words, Assyria, and builded Nineveh. In the city Rehoboth and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same is a great city. And then you have Mizraim, or Egypt, in verses 13 and 14. And you have, of note, I'm not going to name all these, but of note, you look in verse 14, was a son or a people called the Casluhim. And look at the parentheses that it says, out of whom came Philistine. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yes. So the Philistines likely originated from there. And then you have in verses 15 through 19, this one called Canaan. Is Canaan significant for any reason? Yes, one, Canaan is significant because at the end of Noah's life, who was it that was cursed? And so we're going to see if that was brought to bear, and we see that it was. And the second reason is that the Israelite reading this would recognize, whoo, blink, blink, blink. Here's a backdrop of what's going on. Here's a backdrop of these nations. And you look in verses 15 through 18, you have all the ites. You have from Sidon to Heth and on down to the Hamathites. You have the Hivites, the Arvadites, all the ites. And the border, it says in verse 19, this is a land, the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, which is to the north of Israel, as thou comest to Gerar, and Gaza, which was on the very southern border, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, which was just south of the Dead Sea, and Admah and Zeboim, even unto Lasha. And so he gives these boundaries. Is there anything significant about that land? Something very significant about that land, because that's the very land that here we're going to meet a man named Abraham in a few weeks. And that was the very land God would promise to him and to his seed for everlasting generations. Very significant. Okay, and so then you have a summary in verse 20 of the sons of Ham. Now, third listing, sons of Shem, from verses 21 through 31. Now, it's interesting, verse 21, it says, unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber. And from the word Eber, we get the word Hebrews. The Hebrews. And so Shem is not insignificant, though he was saved for last. In fact, that highlights his significance. And this is significant because it had something to do with the Hebrews. And then, of course, you listed the children of Shem. Verse 22, it lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sons of his. And then it gives the children of one of his sons in verse 23. And then it gives the children of another son in verse 24. Significant thing about this other son, Arphaxad, he begat Salah. Salah begat Eber. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one, it says in 25, was Peleg. And his name means division, for in his days was the earth divided. That's going to be important here in a minute. Okay, and then his brother's name was Joktan. In verse 26 through 29 lists Joktan's sons. In verse 30 gave the dwelling of the people of Shem. In verse 31 a summary. And then in verse 32 you wrap up the chapter. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations and their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So chapter 10 showed Israel that they were just a microcosm of the family of humanity. And it affirmed to them that they were part of one world governed by one God. And Israel, watch this is important, Israel had more in common with other nations than they were probably willing to admit. One man said this, all of humanity, in spite of geographical and linguistic differences, share a common origin. That fits what Paul said to the men of Athens in Acts 17, verses 24 through 27. He said, God gives to everybody life. He gives everybody breath. He gives everybody all things. He's made them of one blood, all nations of men to dwell on earth. And he has determined how long they live, and he has determined where they live. You said, no, I chose to move to Georgia. Well, someone else had a hand in that too. So every nation of earth shares common ancestors. Did you know the history of humanity is bigger than the United States of America? God is interested in all nations in spite of their faults, and many of them have some very, very serious faults. God understands how things are and how they've happened to be, and God's sovereignty allows it and superintends it. And we all need to see, though, this tonight, God does not take his hands off. And God was shouting that to Israel here because we see the new world in Genesis chapter 10, what it was after the flood. But Genesis chapter 11 has an interesting spin on the story because it was the new world order, but wait, in disorder. Look at the plans of the new world order here in chapter 11. It says the whole earth. So all these people, they weren't divided at one point. They were one language, it says in verse 1, and they were of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Did we hear anything about Shinar a moment ago? That was the land where Nimrod set up his kingdom. And he built a city called Babel. And they set up tent there, and they lived there together, and they started to make these plans together. Look at verse 3. It says, they said to one another, go to, in other words, hey fellas, let's do something. Let's get together. Hey, okay, go to. Let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. Let's gather some building supplies and prepare them. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, hey, we're ready to do something. Go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. You say, well, what's wrong with these plans? What's wrong with sticking together? Well, there's a few things wrong. Did you notice how they said, let us, a couple times here? Where have we heard that before in Genesis? The first and only time we have heard that in Genesis was out of the mouth of God when he decided to make man in his image and determine what his purpose would be. That was language that indicated a decree of the Almighty. And here's these people saying, okay, let us. And note their plan, we're going to build this thing unto heaven. And we're going to have a name, lest we be scattered. It sounds like they're God now, doesn't it? And they forgot God's order to multiply and fill the earth. They wanted to stay together. You see, man tends to take his life into his own hands. Well, I have my fears about things, so I better prep. Well, I'm concerned about things, so I better get to work and take care of this myself. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I better get mine. God says, let us determine man's life on earth. Man says, let us determine our lives, thank you. That's what happens. Well, what did the Lord think of their determination? He came down to see it. He had to come down to see it. Verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. Evidently, that tower wasn't tall enough to reach heaven, because that great skyscraper was not noticeable enough from God's point of view. He had to come down to look at it. Well, what did God decide when he came down? Look at verse 6. The Lord said, behold, the people's one. They all have one language. And they're starting to do this, and now nothing is going to be restrained from them. Nothing will stop them, whatever they imagine to do. Now, can I ask you something? What had God already determined about the imaginations of man's heart? He already decided he would never curse the ground again or flood the earth again, because the imaginations of man's heart is only evil from his youth. And here is a large assembly of humanity who is determining to stay together and do whatever they have decided to do. And God says that's not good, because man's heart's evil and some bad things are going to come out of this. And so he scattered them. He determined what to do in ironic fashion. Listen to what he says in verse 7. Sometimes I think this is what God thinks of the plans of man and of governments, or perhaps of people who just decide that they're going to do whatever they want to do and they don't care what God thinks. And they say, I'm going to do this. And then God says, go to. Let us go down. And there confound their language, that they might not understand one another's speech. He wasn't just going to knock over their tower or destroy their city, although he could have gone, and it would have been done. What he would do would make it utterly impossible for this blissful, tolerant community to continue their plans together. So he scattered them all over planet Earth, verse 8. And they left off to build the city. It's like God had a bowling ball in his hands called world languages, and he went, strike. And they scattered all over the place. And it's interesting. Do you remember how they said, let us make us a name? Let us make us a name. Well, they got one, verse 9. Therefore is the name of it called Babel. Babel. To them, to the world at that time, Babel was supposedly significant to them because it was, to the world, they called it the gate of the gods. But here, Babel means confusion. Because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. God defined what they tried to do as confusing and defying of him. You see, man tends to take his life into his own hands. However, God confounds man's plans, lest he do whatever he imagines to do. You say, well, what does confound mean? It's the bowling ball effect. Man says, we will do this with this formerly Christian nation. And God says, I've got a bowling ball for you. Man says, we will govern our lands this way. And God says, I've got a bowling ball for you. Rome says, I won't fear God and I will persecute the Christians. And God says, I have a bowling ball for you. Egypt says, I will build the pyramids on the backs of Hebrew slaves. And God says, I have a bowling ball for you. And he takes that bowling ball and he gets a turkey every time. We serve the God who holds a bowling ball. You see, for Israel, reading this, it would help them realize that God still held the bowling ball. He was still sovereign over the nations, and he was aware of them in every way and powerfully ruled their every action. And so it was better off to obey that God rather than be like the nations in their pride and in their selfishness. It was better off to submit to his plans rather than make their own plans and build a name for themselves or preserve their own life. And church, can I ask you tonight, is God still sovereign over the nations? Is he still aware of them in every way? And is he working, watch this, is he working to bring them back together in one body, no matter their race or background? Is his work on earth done through the church, or is it not? Is he done in the United States of America? Is he done in the nations? If he still holds the bowling ball in his hand, it is better off to obey him rather than be like the nations in their pride and in their godlessness. It is better off to submit to his plans rather than make our own and build a name for ourselves, or even what it might be an honest and sincere attempt to preserve our own lives or the lives of those we love. You see, the genesis of the nations tells us that God is sovereign over them. You say, well, God doesn't seem to be confounding plans around the world for me of wicked people. We're about to get up close and personal with the nation who probably felt the same way. But the rest of Genesis will show us that he's the behind-the-scenes God. He's the behind-the-scenes God that even though they might have felt like these nations they just read about had control of things and things were chaotic and they could not be, oh, it's the nation's fault. It's their fault. It's their fault. And we're trying to have these plans and God, and God's not confounding anybody. God's not working to get us ahead at all. Where is God for our nation? But we're about to see that the whole time God was working behind the scenes through a man named Abraham, and through him he would bless the nations, and the people of Israel were his descendants, and God was still at work. And listen, he is still working behind the scenes to rescue the very same nations through local churches and disciples like you and like me. And he will one day confound all the plans of man. You say, well, what about my plans? Aren't my plans for life important? You know, God's not against your plans if they mesh with his. God is not against your plans if they mesh with his. Because here's the reality. Ultimately, everything will work out according to the counsel of his will. You say, well, what a selfish tyrant. No, God is perfect love. And so what he wills is perfect for everybody in their life. And what he wills for the universe is perfect. What he intends for the universe is perfect. Man gets off, and we often get off. And we need to be realigned to his plans. You're called to be a disciple of Jesus among other disciples of Jesus. So you're here tonight. It's called church. And we're called to make disciples. That's our mission. But what about my plans? Shouldn't I have the right to make plans in this life? James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city, continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain. I don't know, today, maybe tomorrow, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And go to now, listen, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. What is your life? It's like you take a can of Febreze, freshen up the living room, spritz, and the vapor's gone. That's your life. Well, these plans that I have, they will happen. They'll come to pass. Well, this is what you ought to say. If the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But right now, you're not saying that. You're saying, this is my life, and I will do whatever I want to do. Or you're living in fear and saying, well, there's too much going on in the world, and there's too much going on in America, and there's too much going on in my crazy life to try to orient everything towards what God wants for me. Life's too crazy to be serious about being a committed follower of Jesus. Life's too crazy to think about trying to help someone else come to know Jesus. I mean, doesn't God know there are some crazy things going on in my life? Yes, there are. And he knows you can't be what he wants you to be without him. And all he's asking you to do is to say, if it's your will for me to do X, I will do that. But if it is not, one way or the other, I will follow Jesus, and I will seek to be used of him in the lives of others. That is why I exist. That is my purpose. God is not, watch this, God is not about, you're over here, and you've got all your bowling pins set up, your plans. They're all your plans, and they're all set up how you want them. And God is not against taking that bowling ball and rolling it down toward the plans of his child and mixing up their plans. Because if your plans do not align with his, for this world and for this nation, then when you stand before him and you give an account of your life, and then you are rewarded according to what you have done with Jesus in this life, eternity on the new earth will depend on that right there. And God would rather you feel the pain of your plans going now than feel the regret of you not following him later. Don't forget who holds the bowling ball. It's the genesis of the nations. Let's pray together. Father, would you help us to look to you, and just every day, God, I know it is hard and it is often difficult to just take time to talk with you and focus on you and ask you to help us follow you. And I know there's burdens here, and there's busyness and responsibilities and life and dreams and goals, all those things. But God, all of our lives could end today. The kingdom could come today. And I'm asking you to revive in our hearts a focus and a singular passion to just be like Jesus, to be your disciples, and to make disciples. God, help us to just see you in every second of life and train ourselves, train our minds, train our actions to align our plans with your will. We love you and thank you for these your people. I ask you to bless them as they go from here. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. We love you very much. Enjoy your evening.